excited to be here. My name is Trinity Norwood. I am a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Nation here in New Jersey. I am also a program coordinator for the Cultural Heritage Fund, and we do educational programming and consulting for schools and organizations that are trying to dispel stereotypes and become allies to the Indigenous community. So I'm very excited to be able to be here and talk with everyone today. I do have a couple of slides. So I say, you know, my father, the Reverend, is a lecturer. I am not. I like to have a conversation. So always feel free to ask questions. To work out the technicality of it, I will be going to the slides, so I won't be able to see the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to jump in and ask me as I'm going through the PowerPoint. And then any questions that are in the chat, once I finish with the PowerPoint, I'll close down and we can get to those as well. I always say there are 3 rules when I do a presentation. The first is that there are no bad questions. We are in a safe space and we're all here to learn. Feel free to ask me anything and I will answer it with an understanding mind to the best of my ability. My second rule is you can ask me anything, but that does not mean I will have the answer. But I'm always willing to do the research and try to get a good answer for you. I also like to make sure that everyone understands that when I am presenting and giving my opinion, it is just my opinion as Trinity. I'm not speaking for all Native people. We're not a monolith. Everybody has different opinions. And let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, please cooperate. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yay, okay, good. Before New Jersey was the state that we all know today, or even before this area was just a colony, this land was called Lenapehoking, or the land of the Lenape. The history of our tribe in this homeland goes back over 12,000 years. Our traditional ancestral lands covered what is modern day New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and even the southern part of New York State. There have even been documented smaller Lenape communities that went as far south as Virginia and as far north as Connecticut. My tribal nation is made up of descendants from 2 historically interrelated tribal communities, the Lenni-Lenape and the Nanticoke people. It is actually believed that many other tribal communities along the eastern shoreboard, the Nanticoke people originated among the Lenape and decided to settle in what is modern day Delaware for fishing. The Lenape, which literally means original people, are called the grandfathers by many other tribal communities because we are regarded as one of the oldest tribal nations. We were among the first to resist European encroachment on our lands and among the first to sign treaties with both the colonial governments and the early US federal government. The Lenape were known as fierce warriors, but also great diplomats, being called in to negotiate peace between other tribal nations. Nanticoke, which is loosely translated to mean Tidewater people, although many people today know them as the Delaware Indians, which is a name that was given to them by European settlers. They were actually among one of the first nations here in the East to resist colonial intrusion. There's actually historical documentation of the Nanticoke people fighting the famed John Smith. Some of our first interactions were with the Dutch, the Finns, and the Swedes. Fun fact that I actually learned just a few months ago while I was on a panel at Stockton University, the Finns and the Swedes shared a similar traditional understanding of being stewards of the land as opposed to ownership of the land. And it is believed that having that common understanding was what allowed peace to reign initially between them and the Lenape people. I always was taught that we had a positive relationship with the Finns and the Swedes, but I never knew why. And so it always excites me when some of my traditional stories line up with historical documentation. So I always thought that was a fun fact. We actually have a continuing relationship with the Swedish government, and I believe it is every 10 years. They send delegates to sign a ceremonial treaty with our community to maintain that bond. My people also had and still have a long-standing history with the Quaker community. Many people have heard of or visited Penn Treaty Park in Philly, where the Great Treaty, or what we call the Treaty of Shakamatsin between William Penn and the Lenape Chief Tanneman, is memorialized. And oftentimes this is where Lenape people kind of come into the timeline of American history. But our relationship with the Quakers actually dates all the way back to the 1670s, where we have historical records of interactions with John Fenwick and his Quaker colony. Today, many members of the Quaker community work with our tribal leaders for various environmental causes and even attend some of our social gatherings. Well, attended some of our social gatherings. We haven't been able to be too social as of late. Although the beginning stages of European immigration in this area started peacefully, as we know, that did not last very long. It's estimated that about 90% of the Lenape population was decimated by disease and war. Many women and children were kidnapped for slavery, amusement, and sex trafficking. Through policies like the doctrine of discovery, Europeans assumed authority over lands that had been stewarded by tribal nations for thousands of years. The Nanticoke's northern migration began in the early 1600s, and that is where they began to reconnect and intermarry with Lenape people, and that's why many people of my tribal community have an ancestry that is both Nanticoke and Lenape. There's also documentation of Nanticoke people traveling on the Trail of Tears in the 1830s to the 1850s. By the end of the 17th century, many Lenape people were forced onto reservations, forced to migrate or assimilate. Many who moved westward settled in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and went as far north as Canada. There are actually active tribal communities still in these areas, and we all interact and work together regularly. We even used to have, we will have again, fingers crossed, a large Lenape gathering where citizens from all tribal nations would be able to get together to share our traditions, our language, our ceremonies. Because what was necessary for our traditions to survive is that different groups held on to certain things. So while many of the Lenape people who stayed here were called keepers of the land, they would make sure that the Lenape people were still here in our ancestral territory, while, for example, many of the Oklahoma communities kept our language. And many of the tribes that moved up north to Canada kept many of our traditional ceremonies. So now when we all get together, we're able to share those with each other and all partake in our traditions. What is particular, not just about our area, New Jersey, but the East Coast in general, is that after a physical genocide took place, many tribal nations that remained on the East Coast had to survive what we called a paper genocide or erasure. Many Lenape people were reclassified in government documents like the census as free persons of color or mulatto to deny the existence of Native people in the state. For example, in 1770, Delaware legislature defined Indians as those living far away from the state. And prior to that, we were defined as non-Christians living in the woods, surviving on mostly deer meat. And they sound crazy, but those are direct quotes. you can Google it. But luckily, my ancestors refused to quit. and would continue to survive by any means necessary. There's evidence of people being taken out of their homes and sent out west all the way into the early 1900s. And so to survive in our ancestral lands, we had to hide in plain sight and assimilate to the culture for fear of being removed. Over the next few centuries, our tribal communities were held together by churches that served as the seat of tribal governance. Christianity had become a part of the tribal tradition, and the church became a place to maintain our tribal governments and pass down language and culture at a time where it was illegal to speak our language or be in groups larger than 3. Our communities were very protective of these tribal churches. The governments inside these churches also expanded into schools for tribal children in the 1800s, and were then followed by tribal governments coming out of the churches and reorganizing as sovereign tribal nations. These churches to this day are still attended mostly by tribal members and are active social centers for tribal events. I want to say maybe about 5 years ago, my father gets the opportunity to preach at one of these churches every year pre-COVID. And one of the churches down in Delaware, there is a door that is right by the pulpit that leads to outside. And I always thought it's so weird that they would let people just kind of come in and walk right through the front of the church during service. But I learned that that door was there so that they could see who was coming down the road. And if it was not a tribal person coming down the road, they could stop their meetings, they could stop their culture sharing, because it was so necessary to keep those things secret out of fear of being removed. And that fear is still very vivid for some of our tribal elders. In 1978, 4 leaders of our community formed a nonprofit tribal corporation to promote the well-being of our community. This modern reorganization led to the establishment of our tribal headquarters and ceremonial lands to better serve our community. Today, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Nation is one of 3 state-recognized sovereign tribal nations in New Jersey, and are interrelated with 2 tribal nations in Delaware as well. A question that I am often asked when I talk about our reorganization in the 70s is, what exactly does that mean? A tribe is defined by having historical context, being continuous, interrelated, and self-governing. So our tribal community is, I always say it's kind of like having dual citizenship. We are a small sovereign nation inside the state of New Jersey. We have a constitution, we have laws that we abide by as a community. We have elected officials. And actually here, the picture in the black and white picture in the corner is a picture of the leaders who organized that reorganization in the 1970s and were our first tribal government officials. And Chief Mark Gould, who is the gentleman holding the fan, is still our current tribal chief. So he must be doing something right. The next slide. So we work really hard to keep our culture alive. And luckily we are living in a time that we don't have to live fearfully, and we can share our culture openly. And we do that through outreach. We have environmental protection efforts. We have historical initiatives. I would say of the past decade, one of our largest historical initiatives was creating a Lenape dictionary so that we could pass our language down. Even just in the past few generations, I'm 32 years old. When I was younger, we did not have language classes in our community. And now we have young people who are able to grow up learning their language and integrating it into their daily lives. And that's just super exciting to me. We do educational presentations just like this one. We work on creating inclusive curriculums. Quite a few of the schools that are down in our community, most of our community lives in Salem County, have worked with our tribal community to make sure that what is in their history books is not inappropriate, as well as creating programs to reach out to the Indigenous youth so that they can feel included in classrooms. We have a presence at the community, state, and national and international events. We try to make connections with other tribal communities so that we can work together. We also work really hard on keeping our culture alive through wisdom keeping. Lenape people, as well as many tribal communities, pass things down through oral tradition. Many things are not traditionally written down. So we have, particularly, it's been pushed by our youth, where they are either writing things down or recording our elders speaking on things so that we can have these things forever. We practice not only our traditional dancing, drumming, and singing, but what I call kind of pan-Indian styles, where we get to go to other communities and participate in powwows and things of that nature. So I always like to say we are still here. We are a vibrant culture, and we bring our ancestry and our ancestors with us everywhere we go. And that's how we keep our culture alive. I always like to finish with talking about being an ally to the community, because that is my biggest hope when I do these presentations, is that I plant the seed somewhere with someone of maybe just a little thing that they can do different in their everyday life to be an ally to the Indigenous community. I think one of the most important things, and something that's small and easy to do, is just acknowledge the Native people. Particularly now, land acknowledgements have become very popular, and I think they are a great tool to open up the conversation about recognizing the history of the land that we are on, no matter where you are. I'm here in Jersey, so I get to acknowledge my ancestors, which is very special to me, but I also try to make sure when I have to travel for an event, I take the time and opportunity to learn about whose ancestors were here in this land and how can I honor them with my everyday actions. And staying true to historical fact, which really makes a big difference, of course. And it can even be small things in life. I have a friend who is a teacher, and she allows me to go through some of her books. And I told her it is very damaging that Native people always talked about in the past tense in history books, because it erases who we are now. And it was something that she had never thought about. But she made sure that before she starts her class, she acknowledges that with her students. And so I got to plant the seed of her thinking about that. And then she planted the seeds with her students thinking about that. And so, acknowledging Indigenous people, it really only has to take a second, and it can ripple into something great. Speaking out about stereotypes, I listed some of the ones that I have personally had to listen to before. You don't look Native American. What does a Native person look like? We all look different. We all come from different backgrounds. We all like to look different. And really, the people that have said those kinds of things to me or to my loved ones are typically thinking about, that stereotypical spaghetti Western kind of thing. And now we know that most of the people that were playing Native people in those spaghetti Westerns were actually Italian. They had, a good tan that day, and they were not Indigenous people. I also often get the question, all Natives live on reservations, which is not true at all. There was the Indian Urban Act actually moved Native people off of reservations into cities in the, I want to say 50s, it was 1940s, 1950s. I'll have to fact check that. But even before that, not all Native people lived on reservations. Actually, in New Jersey, there is no reservation. I was speaking earlier about my community living mostly in Salem County. It's what's called an Indian statistical area. So that means that most of my community does live down there, you know, and everyone's neighbor is a cousin, but it is not a reservation. The only reservation that was here in New Jersey was the Brotherton Reservation. And that disbanded, I want to say in the 1870s. I might have that incorrect. I'm not too good with dates, but I believe it was the late 1800s that the Brotherton Reservation disbanded. All Indians believe is, to me, a red flag. When I am working on consultations and people are trying to send me websites of where they found, you know, good ideas and things of that nature, I always tell them the first thing you need to check is if it's talking about a specific tribe or if it's just talking about Native Americans in general. And to me, that is always a red flag because we all believe different things. You know, we have a common experience as all being Indigenous people, but all of our tribes have different languages, traditions, and ceremonies. We are vastly different. And to make us a monolith is doing a great disservice to how vibrant all of our cultures can be. Ugh and how is something that I have gotten that people thought were a traditional greeting, which is, I don't know any native language that uses ugh or how. Actually in Lenape, if you want to say hello, you say hey, it's spelled H-E. There's it, you guys already know some Lenape. Another one that is used is the term squaw, which is actually a derogatory term. And I've interacted with people who thought that they were honoring me by calling me that, but it is a derogatory term for a woman. Another great way to be an ally to the Indigenous community is to appreciate our culture and don't appropriate our culture. You know, wearing ceremonial items does damage to Native people. There's been such a long history of Native people not being able to own their own ceremonial items, and to make it a costume hurts. Buying authentic Native made crafts is a great way to support Native people. You know, you can go on, I love this website, you can go on Etsy and you can find 100 pages of dream catchers, but it might only be 5 actually Native made crafters who are selling those dream catchers. And if it is a Native made craft, they will specify that is a Native made craft. And that's just, you know, a small way that you can support the Indigenous communities. You can also support the needs of your local tribe. You know, and a lot of people I've met who think about being an ally anticipate there has to be this big thing that they do. And it doesn't have to be. A great example of this is at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a young lady who decided that she was going to support our community by taking the time that she was in quarantine to make masks. And she made masks for our elders. And it was so wonderful for them. They were so grateful. And, you know, she was just had her spare time. She had her talent and she made a great difference. And it, I mean, even that, it could even be something smaller than that. Just speaking up when you hear injustices, or, and I know sometimes this can be difficult, or speaking up and referring people to the correct information about Lenape people, but Indigenous people just in general. That is, did that work? Okay, good. So that's my PowerPoint. That's me doing all of my talk. I want to say thank you so much, Wanishi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my culture and having great questions and accepting me. This was a wonderful experience.